Sermon 27, From the Wilderness to Sinai.
Tonight in our story of the Bible, we'll be talking about from the wilderness of sin to the wilderness of Sinai. As the children of Israel make their journey after their Egyptian captivity to go to Mount Sinai and receive the law from God, which will be their guide as to how they are to conduct themselves, both as far as their civil laws as well as their spiritual guidance would be given in the laws that they would receive at Mount Sinai. In our introduction and starting out, I want to ask a question. I want you to think about it. Most of us have been on a trip with children in the car that bickered and complained and got into arguments. And as you think about that, think about having 2.5 million children that bicker and complain and argue. That's what Moses had to put up with as he was leading the children of Israel across the wilderness. 2.5 million people murmuring and complaining and blaming Moses and his brother Aaron because they were selected by God to be the leaders of the children of Israel, and they were blaming them for everything that went wrong and everything that happened to them. And this is, I guess, a great commentary on mankind, because oftentimes man wants to find somebody to blame. You know, it's easier to blame somebody else than to accept responsibility yourself. They complained about being hungry. They complained about being thirsty. And they complained about being uncomfortable, I'm sure, being out there in the desert. But God gave them meat and bread, the Bible says, to the full. And he did that to see if they would obey him. And of course, in our lesson last week, we noticed that the children of Israel did not obey God. They failed to keep the Sabbath day, when God told them that when the manna would come, that it would not be there on the Sabbath day, and many of them went out on the Sabbath day looking for it and trying to find it. And they were to go out on the sixth day and gather enough to last them through the seventh day, which was the Sabbath, the day of rest. But many of them went out looking for it anyway. And God was testing them, the Bible says, to see if they would obey him. But it turned out that many of the Israelites were greedy, and they did not keep the Sabbath. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Not only did he have first-hand knowledge of everything that he wrote about, but also he had the guidance of God to include the things that God wanted him to include in the first 5 books of the Bible, especially the book of Genesis, because Moses was not there when the events that happened in the first part of the book of Genesis, I should say the whole book of Genesis took place. So he wrote by inspiration those verses. But much of that which he wrote in the other 4 books, he wrote by personal knowledge as well as by inspiration as to what God wanted him to put down for future generations. So the children of Israel now have left Egypt. They're journeying in the wilderness of sin, and that is literally the name of the desert area that they're in. And they are on their way to Mount Sinai. And of course, they're being guided by the cloud that leads them by day and the pillar of fire that leads them by night. And they come to Rephidim. And at Rephidim, they do not have water. They're thirsty. And again, they complain to Moses. And I want to read just a short portion of what the Bible says about the conversation that the people there have with Moses. It says, "Wherefore the people did chide with Moses and say, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do you tempt the Lord? The people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be all ready to stone me." I mean, they're looking to stone me to death. What am I going to do with these people? And can you imagine Moses there, as you picture in your mind, throwing his hands up and saying, I see parents sometimes say that about children. I don't know what to do about these kids. They're driving me nuts. And that's basically what Moses is saying to God. I don't know what to do with these people. Now notice, if you will, every time that Israel has a complaint, it's an exaggeration. You just brought us out here so we're going to die. No. We're thirsty. We need a drink of water. And their only conclusion that they can draw is, we're going to die. You brought us out here in this desert, and you're going to let us die. So Moses takes the elders of Israel with him. He stood up on the rock of Horeb, and he smote the rod against the rock, and it brought forth water. And the children of Israel were able to quench their thirst. Now you have God feeding them with manna. He feeds them with quail, meat, and he provides water for them to drink while they're in the wilderness. Basically, God takes care of their needs. He's supplying what they need, and he's taking care of it. Sometimes in their, as we would say, in their greed, they're looking for more than what God has given them, but God is taking care of their needs. Another event happens at Rephidim that's very interesting, and that is the Amalekites came out to fight against Israel. That's what the Bible says about it. They came out to fight. We're going to be introduced to two groups of people in our lesson tonight. One's the Amalekites and the other's the Midianites. The Amalekites were the descendants of Esau. You know the story of Jacob and Esau, how Jacob stole Esau's birthright. And the Amalekites now are coming out and they're fighting Israel. There's two things that you learn about the Amalekites. Number one, they're very cruel people. I would say they're probably, as we would say, people that live in the wilderness and they're wild type people. Not only are they cruel, they're cowards. We do not find out till almost 40 years later as to exactly why God said to Moses, you're going to be fighting against the Amalekites for generations. That God wanted to punish the Amalekites. Why did he want to do that? When Moses was basically giving his farewell speech to the children of Israel, he reminded them of what the Amalekites did. We don't have that record in the book of Exodus. It doesn't tell us what they did. When the children of Israel went in the wilderness, how that God became angry with the Amalekites because they were cowards and because they were cruel to the children of Israel. And that is, as the 2.5 million people were marching through the wilderness, the Amalekites came out to fight against Israel. They did not confront them to fight. They went to the back of Israel and picked off the women and children and weak and sickly individuals and killed them. That was the attack that the Amalekites were making against the children of Israel. And Moses explains that 40 years later as he gives his farewell address to the children of Israel, and he tells them, remember what the Amalekites did. Remember what Esau's children did. Now I mentioned that because of the conflict there that was between Jacob and Esau. And these are the two families. These are their descendants. And the hatred there, even though Jacob and Esau made up, we might say, before at the end of their lives, still there was family hatred there. The descendants of Esau did not like the descendants of Jacob. And that's what is taking place here. They're attacking them. And the Lord was furious with the Amalekites because of their cowardice and because of what they did to the children of Israel. And these are the descendants of Abraham through Esau. And we need to remember that what is taking place here is a fulfillment the promise of God with these people because they are multiplying. You know, the Bible is giving us a picture of the children of Israel, but as we are seeing the children of Israel grow, all the other descendants of Abraham, their families are growing as well. Those nations are growing. And then to add to that, the descendants of Noah, you know, as we would say, the Asian people and the Hispanic people, and also the Caucasian people like ourselves, you know, the Irish and those people from that part of the country and in around Rome and Italy and all that area, those people were beginning to multiply to fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham. God's promise was that your children would be as the sand on the seashore, as the stars in heaven without number, and Abraham's children were multiplying. Doesn't mean they were all good. Doesn't mean that they were all pleasing in God's sight. But it means that God was keeping his promise. And his promise to Abraham was that his children would be without number. And indeed that promise was being fulfilled. So the Amalekites come out and they attack Israel from the rear. And then of course Joshua leads his army. Joshua, we're introduced to Joshua here in this context, and Joshua is a great man, and he will be throughout all the stories of the Bible a great leader as far as a warrior, and he's brave. And not only is he a great leader and a great warrior, but he is a great man of faith because he trusts God. And Joshua now is leading the children of Israel against the Amalekites. And Aaron and Hur go with Moses up to a high elevation. The Bible says they go up and so they can see the battle. And as long as Moses is holding his hands up, the children of Israel prevail. But when his hands drop down, then the Amalekites began to prevail. So in order to prevent the Amalekites from overpowering the children of Israel, they placed Moses, a stone there for Moses to sit on, and Aaron on one side and Hur on the other. They hold his hands up all day long so that the children of Israel can defeat the Amalekites. And the Bible says that Joshua discomforted the Amalekites and his people with the edge of the sword. It doesn't mean that he completely annihilated the Amalekites because they continue to be around, but he did defeat them in battle, and I guess we'd say he sent them running. He sent them away from Israel, and the children of Israel were protected, those who had been attacked by the Amalekites. Then another event takes place in our story tonight, and that is that as Moses is leading the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage and heading them toward Mount Sinai so that they can receive the law, the news of the children of Israel coming through the wilderness, and it'd be kind of hard to hide 2.5 million people out in the desert. But the news of them coming reaches Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, and Jethro is on his way to meet Moses. And with him is Zipporah, Moses' wife, and Moses' 2 sons. Now, it's interesting that the Bible doesn't tell us exactly all the events and things that happened. But Moses had sent Zipporah and his 2 sons back to the land of Midian to be with Jethro while he was leading the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. Now I believe that was for personal protection. Because you think about the conflict there between Moses and Pharaoh was very angry with Moses at times, and there's no doubt in my mind, if given the opportunity, Pharaoh would have killed Moses' sons and his wife if he possibly could have. And so I believe that was for personal protection. And so now Jethro is bringing Zipporah and Gershom and Eliezer back to Moses to meet him as they're coming out into the wilderness. I want to say something about Jethro here. I want you to notice something about this man when he comes to Moses. He comes out to meet Moses, and when he does meet Moses, and Moses relates to him all the things that has happened, in this meeting, Jethro offers sacrifice unto God. Now, he is not a descendant of Jacob. He's not part of the family of the children of Israel. Who is he? The Midianites were descendants of Abraham through Abraham's wife, or concubine, as the Bible calls her, both wife and concubine, Keturah. Through Abraham's son Midian, by his wife Keturah. So here is another family line, if you please, from Abraham. And they were a lot like Abraham was. We talk about in the Bible the land of Midian. There's really no such place. I mean, it's not like going out, to a certain area and saying this is the land of Midian. What that means is where the Midianites dwell. They did not have a particular place that they lived. But they were like Abraham. They were nomads, and they traveled around the wilderness between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba, there north of the Red Sea. That is where they generally lived. And the reason that they're recognized is because, like Abraham, you may remember when Abraham left the Ur of Chaldees and came into the land of Canaan, God was blessing Abraham, and his people were multiplying. He was having children, and Lot was with him, and Lot's family was growing, and their herds and their flocks were growing. And so this multitude of people were getting more and more and more, and the Canaanites recognized them and said, that they're outgrowing the land. Well, the people of Midian did the same thing. When God told Abraham that how he was to deal with his family, the Bible says that Abraham took all of the children of Keturah and he gave them possessions, and he sent all of them away from Isaac, because Isaac was the promised son. He was the one that was to get all that Abraham had, other than what Abraham had given to his sons through Keturah. And the Bible says he sent them east. He sent them away. He sent them out into the east. And the children of Midian, they traveled about, lived in tents, and traveled about wherever they could find a place to graze their flocks and herds. And that's the way that they lived, just like Abraham had lived. Another point I want to make about the Midianites. Their worship service to God was like Abraham's. They went by patriarchal rule. Just because you read in the Old Testament, I think it's one of the big mistakes people make in the Old Testament. Just because you read in the Old Testament, and most of the Old Testament is written after you get out of the book of Genesis, is written about the children of Israel, doesn't mean that the rest of the people in the world did not believe in God and serve and worship God. They did, under patriarchal law. And Jethro was a fine example of that. Here Moses comes out to meet Jethro. He hears the story of God. He praises God for the victory that God has given over the Egyptians, and he offers sacrifice unto God, according to patriarchal law. And he is not only a family member, a distant relative, if you please, but he's also living under patriarchal law. And he's offering sacrifice unto God. Not only that, but Jethro gives Moses probably some of the best advice that Moses had had up until this point from an individual. Moses' day was usually spent sitting and listening to the squabbles of the children of Israel, personal problems. grudges they had one against the other. He was sitting in judgment, if you please, to listen as a judge would to all the cases that were coming before him. And Jethro said to his son-in-law, you can't continue to do this. There's too many people. You can't hold up under this kind of lifestyle. And the advice that Jethro gave to Moses was, you appoint honest, trustworthy, good men to judge thousands, and to judge hundreds, and to judge 50. And you appoint these men to judge the different tribes. And relieve yourself from this burden of having to hear all the complaints of the children of Israel. And only the weightier matters, if you please, would be brought before Moses, and not the everyday piddly squabbles that individuals seem to have. And that was good advice. So Jethro was a very wise man. Not only that, he was faithful unto God. And Moses was indeed lucky to have him as a father-in-law. At this particular time, the Midianites, as they're called, were not enemies of the children of Israel. Their advice to the children of Israel was basically, you're welcome to come through our land. But don't disturb anything. It's almost like you're telling your relatives, come over and see me, stay as long as you want to, but don't steal anything. That's basically what he's saying. You're welcome. You come and go through my land. But don't mess with anything. So they weren't their enemies. Later on in the Bible, we're going to find that the Midianites were fighting with the children of Israel. But not at this time. And I think a lot of that has to do with the relationship there of Moses and his father-in-law Jethro. Because they're getting along, and there's no family squabbles here. But all of these people, and this is the thing that we need to see, all of these people that we're coming in contact with, the Midianites and the Amalekites, these are all people that were there because of the promise that God had made to Abraham that he would multiply his children. The story is surrounding the children of Israel because it is through Isaac, the selected one, that God would bring about the Messiah, that Jesus would come about. The Old Testament is not just a collection of stories, but it is an unfolding of a plan of God. And God is now bringing the children of Israel to Mount Sinai so that they can receive the law that will govern them in the land of Canaan. That's what this is about. Now, throughout the Old Testament, you're going to have stories, very interesting stories, like the story of Job or the story of Ruth. And someone says, why are those stories told? Those stories are told to encourage the children of Israel what kind of people they need to be. That's why they're told. They're told to encourage you and me today. We would know what kind of people we need to be. That's the reason they're told. But the purpose of the Old Testament is the unfolding and the looking forward to the day that the last fulfillment of the promise of Abraham would be given at the cross, when Jesus would give his life to give back to mankind what was lost in the Garden of Eden. Now that's what the Old Testament is for. That's what the Bible says. Those things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, to see the unfolding of God's plan. And sometimes people are narrow in their thinking, is when they look at the Old Testament, they only think about the children of Israel, and they only think that the rest of the people were barbarians and heathens. That's not true. It's not true. All the way up into the New Testament time, we have individuals that were living under the patriarchal law. I believe the Ethiopian eunuch fell under that, and he was converted to Judaism because he wanted to be closer to God, and he made his journey up there. There were many others that lived under patriarchal law, all the way up until the time that Jesus came. not just the children of Israel following God's law, but many from many nations were following God's law. And so when given the Great Commission, and when you think about that, and given the Great Commission, you have to realize that many of those Gentiles were also following principles that governed them, that were given by their forefathers and handed down through time. And so when the Great Commission was given to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, many of the Gentiles were ready to receive it because they already believed in God. They believed in God. And it was only one short step from believing in the Father to accepting the Son. And that's the reason that the Gentiles in large number, I believe, that's the reason they obeyed the gospel. Because preparation had already been made in the time that God instituted the patriarchal law, the father rule, and continued all the way down through time. But sometimes that gets lost in the Old Testament because we're concentrating on the children of Israel, and the law was given at Mount Sinai. The law that will be given at Mount Sinai, as we'll study about next week in our lesson, was only given to the Jewish people. And that's what Moses says. It's given to us, all of us who are here alive this day. It is their law. The Old Testament was the children of Israel's law. There was no Great Commission in the Old Testament law. God didn't tell the Jewish people, go into all the world and make Jews. That wasn't the purpose of the Old Testament law. It was to guide the children of Israel so that the Messiah could come through them to keep his laws. And what is happening in the wilderness, God, as Moses says, is testing the children of Israel to see if they will obey his law or not. We'll find out next week if they did, as the law will be given on Mount Sinai. If you're here tonight and need to respond to the invitation, won't you do so while we stand and sing?